The Vikings terrorized Europe for 300 years. They conquered England, settled Iceland, sailed across the North Atlantic. These were warriors who made kings tremble, who appeared out of nowhere in their longships and vanished before armies could respond. For 3 centuries, the word Viking meant unstoppable. But when they tried to settle North America around the year 1000, they lasted less than 20 years, and then they left. They abandoned their settlements, packed up their tools, and sailed back across the Atlantic. The Vikings, who had conquered half of Europe, couldn't maintain a single permanent colony in the New World. Why? The usual story goes something like this. It was too far. The journey was too dangerous. They didn't have enough people. The climate was harsh. All of that is partially true. But there's a much simpler reason, one the Viking sagas themselves reluctantly admit. They met people who didn't know Vikings were supposed to be invincible. People who fought back. People who won. The Vikings called them Skrælings. The exact translation is debated, but it probably meant something like wretches or savages. But these so-called savages did something no European power managed for centuries. They stopped the Vikings cold. They made it clear through organized resistance and tactical warfare that Norse colonization was not going to happen on their land. This is that story. Not the Viking saga version, where indigenous people are footnotes and obstacles, but the story of sophisticated societies defending their territory against foreign invaders. You'll discover what North America was actually like in the year 1000, who these warriors were, how they fought, and why they won. You'll see how indigenous military capability, knowledge of terrain, and strategic coordination defeated what was supposed to be Europe's most fearsome fighting force. And maybe most importantly, you'll understand why the question, "What if the Vikings had stayed in North America?" has a straightforward answer. They couldn't. This isn't speculation or alternate history. This is what actually happened, and it's time we told it right. So let's go back to the year 1000 and meet the people who sent the Vikings home. The North America that Vikings encountered around 1000 AD was not an empty wilderness. It wasn't sparsely populated by scattered bands of hunters. It was a continent of diverse, complex societies with thousands of years of history, sophisticated technology, extensive trade networks, and well-developed systems of warfare and diplomacy. When Leif Erikson and his crew made landfall somewhere on the North American coast, probably in what's now Newfoundland, they were entering territories that had been occupied and managed by indigenous peoples for at least 12,000 years. Think about that timeline. By the year 1000, indigenous North Americans had been living on this continent longer than Western civilization has existed from ancient Mesopotamia to today. The peoples the Vikings encountered were most likely ancestors of the Beothuk in Newfoundland, and various groups further south, possibly including ancestors of the Mi'kmaq and other northeastern peoples. Further north, the Vikings also met the Dorset people, who were Arctic hunters with incredible adaptation to one of Earth's harshest environments. These were not simple societies. They had developed technologies and strategies perfectly suited to their environments over millennia. The Dorset people, for instance, had mastered Arctic survival to an extraordinary degree. They built sophisticated snow houses, developed specialized tools for hunting seals and whales, created waterproof clothing from intestines and skins, and navigated the Arctic using detailed mental maps passed down through generations. Their technology was so well adapted that when Europeans arrived centuries later, they adopted many Dorset innovations because their own tools weren't sufficient for Arctic conditions. The peoples further south had different but equally sophisticated systems. They practiced controlled burning to manage forests, which increased game populations and improved hunting grounds. They had complex seasonal migration patterns, moving between coastal fishing grounds in summer and inland hunting territories in winter. They had trade networks that extended hundreds of miles, exchanging furs, copper, obsidian, and other valuable materials. They had territories, boundaries, and systems for negotiating access to resources. And crucially, they had military capabilities. North American indigenous peoples had been engaging in warfare for thousands of years before any European arrived. They had developed tactics, weapons, and strategies. They understood ambush, reconnaissance, defensive positions, and coordinated attacks. They knew their terrain intimately, every path and river and hiding place. They could move silently through forests where Vikings crashed through underbrush. They could survive easily in environments where Norse settlers struggled. This is important to understand because the Viking sagas, our main written sources for these encounters, describe indigenous peoples as if they were primitives. They call them Skrælings. They describe them with contempt. But the sagas also, despite themselves, reveal the truth. These people were effective warriors who controlled their territory and were willing and able to defend it. So when Vikings arrived with their iron, weapons, and European fighting tactics, they weren't arriving in an empty land waiting to be conquered. They were entering someone else's home. And the people who lived there were about to make it very clear that they weren't leaving. The first encounters between Vikings and indigenous peoples were probably trading interactions. The sagas mention early exchanges of goods, fur pelts from indigenous peoples, in return for cloth and milk products from the Norse. This makes sense. Both groups had something the other wanted, and neither side knew much about the other yet. But tensions escalated quickly. The sagas are vague about exactly what triggered the violence, which probably means the Vikings didn't understand what they'd done wrong. One saga mentions that a Norse bull escaped and frightened indigenous people, leading to conflict. Another describes a trading dispute. What's most likely is that Vikings, accustomed to raiding and taking what they wanted in Europe, tried the same approach in North America. They badly miscalculated. In Europe, Vikings had several advantages. They had mobility, surprise was on their side, and they usually struck monasteries and coastal villages that had no standing armies. They'd hit fast and leave before organized resistance could form. But in North America, they couldn't raid and run. They were trying to establish permanent settlements, which meant they had to stay in one place, and the people they were dealing with weren't unarmed, monks. They were warriors defending their homeland. The sagas describe what they call battles, though they're probably describing ambushes and skirmishes. Vikings would be working in their fields or gathering wood when arrows would come flying from the forest. Groups of Norse men would be attacked by larger forces of indigenous warriors who appeared, fought, and melted back into the landscape before the Vikings could organize a response. Ships were attacked by fleets of skin boats, small and maneuverable, that could surround a longship. One saga describes a battle where indigenous forces used what the Vikings called a war ball, some kind of projectile weapon that made a terrifying noise and seemed to explode or scatter when it hit. Historians have debated what this was. Some think it was a type of sling with a large stone. Others suggest it might have been an exaggerated description of a simple catapult, or perhaps just the sound of many arrows landing at once. What's clear is that it scared the Vikings badly. The sagas admit, reluctantly, that Vikings ran from these fights. The famous line from the Greenlander's saga, Karlsefni and his men had realized that although the land was excellent, there would always be fear and strife dogging them there on account of those who already inhabited it. In other words, we can't win this. Think about what that means. Vikings, the same warriors who had conquered Northumbria and besieged Paris, were admitting defeat against indigenous forces. These weren't massive pitched battles with thousands of soldiers. These were small-scale conflicts, probably involving dozens or at most a few hundred fighters on each side, but the Vikings couldn't sustain it. They couldn't maintain their settlements while under constant threat of attack by an enemy that knew the terrain, could strike without warning, and then disappear. The archaeological evidence supports this. At Meadows in Newfoundland, the confirmed Viking settlement, excavations show it was occupied for only a very short period, maybe just a few years, and then abandoned. There's no evidence of a prolonged siege or major battle. They just left, packed up and went home. And the reason they left is simple. They were losing. Not in one dramatic final battle, but through sustained resistance that made colonization impossible. Quick pause here. If you're finding this perspective on Viking history interesting, drop a like on this video. It actually helps more than you might think. The algorithm tends to bury historical content that challenges popular narratives, so your engagement makes a real difference in getting this story out there. All right, back to the conflicts. Now let's talk about why indigenous peoples had every advantage in these confrontations. This wasn't luck. This was the result of fighting on home ground with superior tactical knowledge and appropriate technology for the environment. First, numbers. The Vikings who reached North America were small groups. The sagas mention expeditions of 1 to 3 ships, each carrying perhaps 30 to 70 people. So we're talking about maybe 100 to 200 Norse settlers total in any given expedition, and that's including women and children. They couldn't afford to lose people. Every death was a significant blow to their population. Indigenous peoples, meanwhile, could draw on much larger populations. If one community faced Viking aggression, they could call on allied communities for support. Vikings were isolated. Indigenous peoples had networks. Second, logistics. Vikings in North America were at the end of the longest supply line in their world. Getting to North America meant sailing from Norway or Iceland to Greenland, then from Greenland across the Labrador Sea to Newfoundland. This was a journey of weeks or months, depending on weather. If they needed iron or tools or reinforcements, those had to come across the Atlantic. They couldn't just send for help. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, were on their home territory. They had unlimited supplies of arrows, intimate knowledge of food sources, and could retreat to allied communities if needed. Third, tactics. Viking warfare in Europe relied heavily on shock tactics and superior armor. Vikings would form shield walls, use iron weapons against opponents who often had inferior metallurgy, and leverage their mobility with ships to strike where they were unexpected. But none of this worked well in North American forests. You can't form a shield wall in dense woods. Iron armor is heavy and exhausting to wear in rough terrain, and Vikings had no mobility advantage on land against people who could move silently through forests and knew every path. Indigenous tactics were perfectly suited to the environment. Ambush warfare, hit-and-run attacks, archery from concealment. Vikings wore armor that could stop some arrows but was useless if you couldn't see where the arrows were coming from. Indigenous archers didn't need to engage in close combat. They could shoot from cover, fall back, regroup, and attack again. The Vikings never even saw who was shooting at them half the time. Fourth, knowledge. This is perhaps the most important factor. Indigenous peoples knew every inch of their territory. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They knew where water sources were, where game could be found, where the terrain was dangerous. Vikings were navigating foreign territory with no maps and no guides. The sagas mention Vikings getting lost, wandering into dangerous areas, not recognizing hazards. Indigenous peoples could use this. They could lead Vikings into difficult terrain, attack when the Norse were vulnerable, and escape through routes Vikings didn't know existed. Fifth, sustainability. Vikings tried to recreate Norse farming in North America. They brought cattle, they tried to plant barley, they built European-style houses. This required constant labor. They had to clear fields, tend animals, maintain buildings. All of this made them predictable. They had to stay near their farms. Indigenous peoples had mobility. They could move with seasons, follow game, relocate if necessary. Vikings were tied to fixed locations, which made them easy targets. The sagas reveal something interesting when you read between the lines. They describe indigenous warriors as numerous, fierce, and effective. They mention Viking casualties. They describe Norse people being afraid, fleeing battles, abandoning settlements. These are not descriptions of easy victories against primitive opponents. These are descriptions of a military force that couldn't hold territory against organized resistance. One saga mentions that the Norse tried to trade with indigenous peoples and then betrayed them by attacking during negotiations. The indigenous response was swift and overwhelming. The Norse were driven back to their ships. This wasn't just random violence. This was strategic. Warfare by people defending their land and responding to aggression. What's remarkable is that we're only hearing one side of this story. The sagas are Viking sources, written by people who wanted to portray their ancestors as brave explorers and mighty warriors. They had every reason to minimize indigenous capabilities and exaggerate Norse strength. And even so, they can't hide the basic truth. Vikings left North America because they couldn't maintain settlements in the face of indigenous resistance. Imagine what the story sounds like from the indigenous perspective. Foreign invaders arrive in strange boats. They try to establish permanent camps on your people's territory. They're aggressive, they don't understand local customs, they try to take resources that don't belong to them. So your warriors do what warriors do. They defend your land. They use their knowledge of terrain, their superior numbers, their tactical skills, and it works. The invaders leave. The threat is eliminated. That's the story the Skrælings would tell. A story of successful defense of homeland. A story of tactical victory. Not a footnote in someone else's saga, but a central narrative of protection and resistance. We're about 2/3 through now. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. There's a new video every week on historical stories that don't get told enough. Hit that subscribe button and you won't miss them. Now let's talk about what this whole episode reveals about historical memory. Here's what makes this story even more fascinating. It basically disappeared from European consciousness for almost 1,000 years. The sagas that mentioned Vinland and the Skrælings were known in Iceland and Scandinavia, but they were treated as semi-legendary stories. Most Europeans had no idea Vikings had reached North America. Columbus and the explorers who came after him thought they were discovering a new world. They had no clue Europeans had been there before. This is strange when you think about it. Vikings kept sagas. They passed down oral histories. They wrote things down on vellum. The story of Vinland existed in Icelandic literature. So why was it forgotten? Part of the answer is that it was a failure. Vikings didn't establish lasting settlements. They didn't bring back massive wealth. They didn't conquer territory. From a European medieval perspective, the Vinland expeditions were unsuccessful. There was no glory to celebrate, no kingdoms founded, no treasures to show off. So the stories faded. They became curiosities, saga tales that might or might not be true. But there's another reason, darker and more important. The story of Vinland didn't fit the narrative Europeans wanted to tell about themselves. When European colonization of the Americas really began in the 1500s, the prevailing ideology was that European Christians had a right and duty to conquer and convert the New World. Indigenous peoples were portrayed as primitives who needed European civilization. This narrative justified everything from slavery to genocide. The Viking sagas, if anyone had paid attention to them, contradicted this story. The sagas showed indigenous peoples as capable of organized resistance. They showed Europeans failing to establish colonies. They showed that superior technology and European tactics weren't automatically dominant. This was inconvenient, so the stories stayed obscure. It wasn't until the 1960s that archaeological evidence confirmed the sagas were true. Helge and Anstein Ingstad excavated Meadows and found unmistakable Norse artifacts: a bronze pin, iron nails, a stone anvil, a spindle whorl. This was definitely a Viking settlement, and it was definitely in North America. The sagas were vindicated, but here's the irony. When the story of Viking America was rediscovered, the focus went right back to the Vikings. The headlines were about Viking achievement, Viking exploration, Viking bravery. The indigenous side of the story remained mostly invisible. The Skrælings were mentioned in passing, if at all. The narrative became about how Vikings reached America first, how they were great explorers, how they predated Columbus. Very few people asked the obvious question, why did they leave? And even fewer centered the indigenous perspective. How did these communities defend their territory? What does this tell us about indigenous military capability and political organization? Think about what this erasure means. For almost a millennium, European sources ignored or downplayed one of the most significant facts about indigenous North America in the year 1000. It was defended. It was not empty, not undefended, not waiting for European conquest. It was controlled by people who were willing and able to fight for their land, and they won. This matters for how we understand everything that came after. When Columbus arrived in 1492, he wasn't entering a vacuum. He was entering territories controlled by complex societies. The Spanish conquests of the 1500s weren't easy victories of civilization over savagery. They were brutal military campaigns against organized opposition, and they only succeeded through disease, superior metallurgy in very specific contexts, exploitation of political divisions, and overwhelming numbers of colonists over time. The Viking failure in the year 1000 is a preview of what could have happened to later European colonization if circumstances had been different. If indigenous peoples hadn't been devastated by diseases they had no immunity to. If Europeans hadn't had such significant technological advantages by the 1500s. If colonizers hadn't arrived in such massive numbers. The Skrælings showed that indigenous peoples could defend their territories against European invaders. Later history showed that under different circumstances, they kept doing exactly that for centuries. There are stories from all over the Americas of indigenous resistance. Lautaro defeating the Spanish in Chile, Metacom's War in New England, the Seminole Wars in Florida, the Plains Wars across the western United States. These weren't primitive peoples fighting hopelessly against inevitable conquest. These were sophisticated military forces using effective tactics. They lost, ultimately, not because they couldn't fight, but because they faced overwhelming population disadvantages after disease epidemics, and because European colonization was backed by entire empires with nearly unlimited resources. But the Skrælings in 1000 AD faced Vikings without these massive disadvantages, no epidemic diseases, no huge population imbalance, no vast imperial resources backing the colonizers. And in that more equal contest, indigenous peoples won decisively. This brings us back to the original question: what if the Vikings had stayed in North America? The answer isn't speculative. We know what would have happened because we know what did happen. Vikings tried to stay. Indigenous peoples made it impossible. The Vikings left. That's not alternate history. That's just history. So let's sum up what we've covered. Around the year 1000, Vikings reached North America and attempted to establish settlements. They encountered indigenous peoples they called Skrælings. These weren't scattered primitive bands. They were sophisticated societies with military capabilities, territorial control, and strategic coordination. When Vikings tried to colonize, indigenous peoples resisted effectively. They used superior numbers, knowledge of terrain, appropriate tactics, and sustained pressure to make Norse settlement untenable. The Vikings, unable to maintain their colonies, abandoned them and returned to Greenland and Iceland. This story challenges several popular myths. The myth that Vikings were invincible warriors who conquered wherever they went. The myth that indigenous North Americans were simple, primitive peoples who would naturally lose to Europeans. The myth that European colonization of the Americas was somehow inevitable or easy. The truth is more interesting. The truth is that for almost 2 decades, somewhere on the North American coast, indigenous warriors and European invaders fought a series of battles and skirmishes, and the indigenous peoples won. They defended their territory. They sent the Vikings home. And then life went on as it had for thousands of years. The Vikings' failure in Vinland is one of history's great unsung victories, not for the Vikings, obviously, for the Skrælings, for the indigenous peoples who looked at these strange men in their strange boats and said, "No, this is our land. You're not welcome," and then made that decision stick. When we ask, what if the Vikings had stayed, we're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why didn't they? And the answer is simple. They tried. They failed. They left. Because the people who already lived there were more than capable of defending their homes. That's not what if. That's what happened, and it deserves to be remembered correctly. All right, that's the story of the Skrælings and the Viking expeditions to North America. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These deep dives take real time to research and write, and knowing people are actually watching and learning makes it worthwhile. If you found this valuable, subscribe to the channel. There's a new video every week exploring historical stories that deserve more attention. Next week, I'll be covering another lesser-known encounter that changed history in ways most people don't realize. Leave a comment. Did you know about the Viking settlements in North America before this? What other historical stories do you want to see from indigenous perspectives? The comment section is always interesting for these kinds of videos. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what was written down by the winners. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that almost got forgotten. We'll keep digging them up.